So tonight, it's all about the brain. The brain is all about connectivity. There are over 100 billion cells in the brain, each of which has 1,000 connections. That's literally trillions of connections. So connectivity is the reason for brain function. An American humorist, Emo Phillips, once said that I used to think the brain was the most wonderful organ in my body, then I realized who was telling me this. So the brain is literally wonderful organ. But sometimes the wires get crossed or broken, and brain disorders arise. There are literally hundreds of such disorders, and most people has been touched personally by one of them, be it depression, epilepsy, Alzheimer's, autism, Parkinson's, cerebral palsy, and the list goes on. These are just a few of the disorders that affect millions of Ontarians. But there is reason for hope, because right here in Ontario, there are literally hundreds of neuroscientists, clinicians, patient advocacy groups, and companies working towards a better care for patients with brain disorders. Ontario, in fact, has some of the greatest number of neuroscientists in pretty well anywhere in the world. Much as the brain is about connectivity, the Ontario Brain Institute is all about these connections. We're a provincially funded institute that connects the Ontario strength in neuroscience, commercialization, and clinical care. We connect researchers, patients, and their advocates, and companies to deliver the promise of new treatments and better care for neurologic disease. So all of us should be informed and engaged around the issues dealing with neurologic disorders as patients, family members, caregivers, and colleagues. We also believe that sharing the experiences of the research and advances will lead to a better understanding, less stigma, and a stronger community. So the OBI has regularly hosted public talks to do just this kind of connectivity, so thanks for being here. Tonight we're in for a real treat for two reasons. One is the moderator, and the other, of course, our speaker. Andre Picard is the award-winning health journalist who's been with the Globe and Mail for over 20 years. He's a best-selling author, renowned speaker, and an advocate for improving the health of Canadians. He's widely considered the top health journalist in the country. His approach to researching, documenting, and sharing health issues through the eyes of patients, healthcare workers, caregivers, and other individuals provides compelling insights into the everyday challenges. His broad scope of research areas, including HIV and AIDS, brain disorders, healthcare reform, and food safety, to name just a few, inform the public on relevant, timely, and real-world issues. The light he shines on complex issues through his writing makes a real and lasting difference in how the public, government, and policymakers work towards improving the health care of Canadians. Mr. Picard has received numerous awards and was named Canada's first public health hero by the Canadian Public Health Association and a champion of mental health by the Canadian Alliance on Mental Illness and Mental Health. So thank you, Andre, for joining us this evening. And now to my predecessor, Dr. Donald Stuss. Dr. Stuss is not just a world-leading neuroscientist. As the founding president and scientific director of the Ontario Brain Institute, he, along with the late Joseph Rotman, shared their vision for the idea of this connectivity in action, that he can accomplish more if we do work together. Dr. Stuss is a world authority on traumatic brain injury, dementia, and stroke, especially as it relates to the frontal lobe function. He gave the world a new understanding of what our frontal lobes do, basically the chief executive officer of the brain, of us. During his career, he's published more than 175 articles, 48 chapters, and co-wrote a book that has been described as the Bible of frontal lobe function. Don is the recipient of numerous high honors, including the Order of Ontario, and the rank of university professor here at University of Toronto, the highest academic title bestowed by this institution. Before starting and leading up to the OBI, he served as the founding director of the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest Health Sciences and helped turn that small geriatric hospital into a world-leading research center on aging. So I've come to know Don over the last several months during my recruitment, and now during the whirlwind education I'm getting at his hand as the new OBI director. Don has been very generous with his time and his advice and his trust in me while turning the Institute over to new leadership, albeit with some adult supervision. So we've come to admire his experience and leadership and will continue to value that going forward. Tonight, Dr. Stuss will be talking about lessons from life, lobotomies and lies, stories from his large clinical career, which will undoubtedly leave us all with a deeper appreciation for the human brain. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Donald Stuss.
Well, that took up most of the evening. Andre says his introduction was longer than how long I'm going to talk. So we'll see what we're going to do. So I want to talk to you a little bit about lessons from life, lobotomies, and lies. And the first thing I want to tell you about this isn't what I'm going to talk about is not a one-person job. There are many of us who worked on this internationally together, and I want to share credit with them, and the blame, of course. So I'm going to talk, I have kind of 8 little sections I want to go to, and every one of them, other than the introduction, actually represents an individual or a group of individuals who taught me an important lesson, to help understand the brain, but also to teach me how to help them. And so what I'm going to do is for every story that I tell, I'm going to give one observation and then discuss kind of where in the brain the dysfunction is. What are the characteristics of the dysfunction? And possible, can I give you some supporting research initiatives? And finally, what lessons can we learn? Can we all learn from this? So, introduction. I'm going to talk about the brain. And we can do more than that. That it's not just the brain that goes. There are stories not about genetics or about the neuron, about the neural network. It's about an individual in society. And as when I talk about the brain, we no longer say this is the brain and we talk about brain dysfunction from here up. This is my brain too. What I eat, what I exercise is part of my brain. But this is my brain. How we interact is also going to affect my brain functioning. And if something happens to me, how I interact with that context is very, very important in the future. So now we're going to focus on one part of the brain, and it's the frontal lobes. That's what I do, and they said the Bible. And as you would expect, it's in the front part of the brain. And it's that part of the brain that in many ways defines us as human. Now, we're going to look at it from different aspects. It's the yellow part, and you're going to see several things. You can look at it from underneath. Everything that's in yellow has been connected with a part of the brain. You can slice the brain in half and take a look on the inside part. And what we're going to do is talk about patients, individuals who suffer dysfunction in different regions, and say what has happened to them, because we used to talk about this one part of the brain, which is 25 to 33% of the brain, as one thing. And yet, how can that huge part of the brain be one thing when we start looking at all of the other parts of the brain and we parcelate it? And it's because it's a mystery. It's because it's been difficult to understand. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples from daily life to talk to you about what the frontal lobes do, because I want to say not just what happens in individuals and patients, but you will see that all of us have a range of frontal lobe functioning of how this brain works. And my story that I tell, and I've told this for many years, is called Can of Peas. Now there are 2 people living in a house, and they have a basement, and they're preparing for dinner, and the one preparing the dinner says to the other, I want you to go downstairs to get me a can of peas. And the person goes downstairs, walks down the stairs, and sees on the way down a hammer. So the person picks up, this is dangerous, puts it up, puts it back on the workbench, then starts to go back upstairs, and the person upstairs says, did you bring me and the person says, can of peas. Now, that's your frontal lobes. That can of peas are your frontal lobes working. So number 1, what happened as you were going down the stairs? You got distracted. And distracted doesn't keep you focused. But did you forget it? No. And what happens is you forgot to remember it, which is very subtle, but it's true. And many of us have this in life, and what the frontal lobes do is enable us to kind of work that through. So I think that's a key part of understand what the brains do. So let me just go through this and pinpoint, because I'm going to highlight a bit where we are and then come back to the part of the brain, because we have to do a little bit of anatomy to get here. So remember what I said, that it's 1/3 of the brain, 25 to 33%. And we used to talk about it as if we didn't understand what it did. And we did call it a mystery. But I am going to show you, and we're going to start teasing out what different regions do. There's an area here called the frontal pole. Okay, that's the area there. That's very important. It's the area that's the most developed in man compared to any other species. Phylogenetically and ontogenetically, it kind of separates us. There is a region on the lateral side, left and right, that occurs. And then underneath it, there's something called ventral lateral, this part that comes down here. But as you saw in the rotating picture, if you looked underneath, there's an area here called the ventral medial. Ventral is like the stomach, or orbital frontal. And you see as well the pole there as well. So you can see I'm parcellating out different regions. And if you slice that brain in half, you can see what happens here is you get those same areas here, the ventral medial frontal polar, but there's an area called the anterior cingulate that kind of is important for the rest of the brain. So I need you to keep that in mind. We'll come back and we'll reiterate this. So what I've tried to show you is that there is a lateral region, there's a polar region, there's a medial region, and there is an underneath region, which is called the orbital frontal. And every one part of that does something different. So I'm going to another example of what the frontal lobes do. And this is a good example. And the example I want to use is Simon Says. Everybody knows what Simon Says, right? It's the game, and it's actually what you play and what kids do to learn how the frontal lobes do. And the game is somebody's kind of in the lead and says, when I say Simon Says, you do it. If I don't say Simon Says, you don't do it. Okay? Now, I need you to work with me on this because this is an example on this. So if I say, Simon Says, raise both your hands. Okay, let them down. See how easy it is? So that's, I don't even have to go further than that. So you will see later on, the bottom line is, you will also tell a story, find out, is that the key thing about frontal lobe functioning is it's involved in everything that we do. And it's, hopefully I'll get across the idea that sometimes each of us is not too far off from some of the patients and individuals with disorders that we see. I had a lot more to show this, but that was so good, I'm not even going to do this. So I'm going to actually start off with a story of a person who doesn't have a disorder, because I want to drive home this construct of what happens in normal life. And this is, and by the way, I use the names of Bob and Jane because I try to keep it as anonymous. I find if I always call people the same thing, then I'm careful not to go, because it's very important to keep anonymity here. So Bob was a man in his late 20s, early 30s, if I remember his story. He had been married for a few years, who had kind of gone off the path and had a girlfriend, and decided that he was going to go one evening and spend the night with his girlfriend. And he goes, or at least to spend the evening, and he ends up spending the night and not coming back till the next morning. And his wife looks at him, Jane, says, Bob, where have you been? He says, well, I went down for a drink with my friend Joe, and we had a couple drinks, and she says, wait, I called the bar. You were never there. He says, well, no, I was. I was just in the back. The bartender never saw me, and Joe and I were there. And then we had too many drinks, and I figured what I'm going to do is, it's not fair to drive home. I went and stayed over at Joe's, just to be safe. I'm sure you'd want me not to drive drinking. And she said, I called Joe. And he said, not only did you not stay the night, he never went drinking with you. And Bob looks nonplussed, and he says, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Now, that's somebody who is, quote, neurologically normal. I'm going to come back to this, because there's a lesson somewhere there. There's a lesson in the sense of how this plays out. So that story is about a normal person, and I'll use that as a model for everything else. But the real thing we're going to do is talk about patients, individuals who suffered some type of damage to their brain, and how they have been examples as partners. I often see them as that we work together to understand, to help them. It's also a bit of a story about research methods. I want to show you how what patients have taught me, what those individuals have taught me, is how to develop a research project that actually start to understand, that might lead to an understanding of the problem, but also end up leading to rehabilitation. I'm a clinician and a scientist. I'm hoping to tell through the stories of patients and to give you a clarity of the example of how it's lived. But I also hopefully that I'm skilled enough to weave these stories back in to help you to have an understanding of what the functions are of the frontal lobes. Now, a bit of a warning, by the way, if you understand, is that I have permission from all of the individuals explicit to share these stories, or if they happened many, many years ago when we didn't have, is what I've done is I've changed the details, etc. And as you know, as I said, I'll call everybody Bob and everybody Jane. Now, let me talk about the story of first Jane. This is my first story. I'm in the hospital and I'm doing coverage, and I get asked to see Miss Jane, who is in her late 60s, early 70s, who's lying in bed unresponsive. And I'm asked to go and make a diagnosis. And the diagnosis is very important because, number one, she's sitting there unresponsive. Is she demented? If she's demented, she's going to a nursing home. Number two, does she have catatonia? Does she have then she's going to go to a psychiatric ward. So the question is, what does she have? So I go and I say, and examine her, and I sit down and I go and I say, how are you today, Miss Jane? And I get no response, and I didn't expect a response. But I looked at her, and I looked at her looking at me. And I said, well, she's looking at me in a way that made me say, I have to wait. And I sat and waited, sitting by her bedside for several minutes, and then her lips move. And I leaned forward and I said, what did you say? And she said, not that well. Now, I just made a diagnosis right there, because when that happens, it tells you very specifically that she has a problem deep in the mid part of the brain. Remember I told you that part that's split in half? She has a problem right down in there, and since the way it developed, that is, she didn't have a history of dementia, that it was likely that she had bilateral tumors deep in the brain, in the frontal part, and that's exactly what she had, and she was surgically treated. You can see where the medial part of the brain is, right in there, deep in there, and that's also part of the anterior cingulate. That this part of the brain is very important to this idea of getting up and going. So how does it affect us? It's slowness. We can't get up and move, and everything gets slowed down. By the way, there has been some suggestion in the literature on aging that this is a system that kind of goes down with aging, that we have a little lack of energy. We call it energization. In clinical terms, we call it apathy, that person is apathetic. And it sounds bad, right? It's apathetic. It's if they don't care, they don't have any motivation. And the truth is, it's not a motivation or a will issue. It's a physiological inability to drive the system. Now, sometimes it's motivation, but in these cases like this, it's not. So we did a little study on this, and can we come up with an experiment? And these are not patients like these, but these are patients who've had primarily strokes throughout the brain. And remember, I study the frontal lobes. And so we look at patients with all of them, and we do a very simple task. All they have to do, and you can see there's 5 little lights there, and there's 5 buttons underneath. Every time a light comes up, as quickly as you can, press the button underneath it, next light up underneath. So it's very fast. You do it for 500 trials, and it goes very, very rapidly. And this is now a series of patients. I need to orient you a little bit. This is a reaction time test, so it's how fast you go. These are the patients divided up into the regions I've talked about on the right lateral, right here, sorry, left, superior medial, that's on the inside up in here, and then the inferior medial, compared to a group of matched individuals who have no neurological disorder, no strokes. And what you see clearly is that if you have damage in this area, you are slow. And it's an interest. So it's important because a slowness is not a motivational thing. And there are lessons then to be learned from that issue of slowness. So the question that we had here, the lesson for me, number one, be patient with your patients. Sit and listen. That sometimes you have to read more than the overt. Had I said she was catatonic, she would have gone off into a psychiatric ward, and the tumors might never have been fixed, might never have been picked up. But it's also important, this idea of listening to the patient before jumping to conclusions. It also tells me something very specific about one region of the frontal lobes that people didn't know before. Now, this is part of the titles, lies, damn lies, etc. When I was in the Boston VA hospital, I got to see a series of patients, and we wrote about confabulation. Confabulation is a term we use for someone who produces spontaneous, erroneous stories. Just stories come up and make them. And there was lots of stories about why people do this. And people say, oh no, they're filling up their lapses in memory, etc. Well, let me just tell you and show you a bit about these individuals. There were characteristics about the stories that they told. Sometimes they would pull things in from the external environment into their stories. So one of the stories we had, somebody was saying, you know, why are you here now? And the person said, I'm here to fix the pipes. They're in a washroom. At the same person, another time, why are you here? Says, well, I'm here to in an air conditioning plant. There's an air conditioning here. There was a third time, the same thing. Now remember, the things get pulled in. The third time, the person said, I'm at Cuttyhunk Island in Dukes County, and threw us off totally to realize there was a map there. And he was just incorporating things that went in. So these things get pulled into the environment, and then the stories get told. And you'll notice a bit, by the way, that this is different from my I'm sticking to it story. They have no monitoring of output or consequences. So I have a couple of good examples there. We had, all the patients were together, and there was this one of the confabulators who told the story, came up to one of the patients who was paranoid and said, you know what I just saw on TV? A big crane ripping out your house and people falling out of it. And so he was just so you can imagine though what the paranoid patient was thinking about this. It's on TV, it's got to be real. Another time is this, it would depend what happened. There was this issue of scars on this one. We said, where'd you get the scars? He said, well, it was during World War II, and I came across this young German woman and surprised her, and she shot and killed me. And then I came back to life. Another time it was that what he was doing is that he was telling a story and rescuing somebody. So these stories all fit in. But responses may vary to the same question. And I'm not sure if this was the same individual, but they had a scar in the face. But the point is, one time he was rescuing President Kennedy, another time a shark attacked him for the same thing. So things got incorporated. They made up these stories. Here's the clincher. Against the background of intact knowledge, there was one of the patients who was a very, very famous doctor that the people used to bring in cases to be diagnosed, and he was still considered the best, and yet he would tell these stories like this. And this idea of this disconnection between what people knew and what they said or not. So what part of the frontal lobes are there? This is the part that tends to be impaired, and this orbital area, frontal area. And it's an area that's relevant for emotional regulation and for kind of looking at the feedback of what things that are going on and monitoring the impact that you have on behavior. When you have damage in the areas, you pull out lots of memories. Memories get mixed up, you pull things in, and that's one of the prevalent theories that has come, and a lot of that work has been done. We did some in Boston, but also here at Baycrest. And the types of errors depends upon the content and extent. So we just said that before. So we now learned a little bit about the medial area, deep inside, slow. We know a little bit about the emotional area. I also had an opportunity to study people who had had frontal lobotomies. And I think everybody knows one flew over the cuckoo's nest, right? So frontal lobotomy, so these sections of the brain are called lobes. So when you have a frontal lobotomy, that means you remove the frontal lobes. They never did that, by the way. They didn't actually remove the frontal lobes. They took a section. It was also called a leucotomy, and that would mean a cutting of the area. And this is what they did. This is what they looked like. And this, we got to remember, there were no treatments at this time. This was in the middle. People were treated for this after World War II. One was they put a little knife or they cut a burr hole through the skull, and they cut it like this. And the idea here, notice this is the cortex, this is the connecting white matter. The idea here is that they had done through work that had done in animals, that people became more settled. Now remember, we often give drugs to people today in doing that, but this is what they did, and people potentially became more settled. This was another technique that was done where they could actually see, where they cut right through and they could see where they were cutting to get the area. So I studied these people some 25 years after. But I want to show you this little contrast. This is Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And is that going to trigger on its own? Take it. You can see the cut. Now, that's in the movies. Let me show you the reality. I could find very few cognitive deficits in these patients. Surprisingly so, everybody had. But so I looked at personality things. So I looked at personality tests. None of them worked. So I came up with my own test of emotional processing, because people always said this was, you had to change person, they're not the same. And I did a very simple test. The test that I did was show scenes that were happy, sad, or neutral, never said that they were happy, never used the word, and then showed faces that were happy, sad, or neutral. Again, never showed the word, and just said, which face goes best with this scene? Here's a bit of data from that lobotomy research. I'm going to just give you a little bit of background in. This is all military people, because this often would have been occur after World War II. This is a group of military men who came through unimpaired from the same war, all the equivalent. There were 4 groups of people who all had been diagnosed as having psychosis or schizophrenia in those days, in World War II, how they diagnosed them. 3 of them had received a lobotomy. 1, 2, 3. And they were divided according to their level of social recovery. One group actually did not get the lobotomy, and they were separate and stayed in the hospital. This is probably the only study that had a control group like this. There was a person who was actually prepped for the surgery. The surgeon didn't show, and he never got the lobotomy. Now, there's a couple of lessons that I want to show you in this. Number 1, remember, you saw Jack Nicholson. What do we all think about the frontal lobotomies? They're impaired, but it's not 0. They actually get some right. And even these people get some right. But the key thing is, it wasn't whether the score was right, it was what they said that became relevant. So what I did, very smartly, in retrospect, is say, now you chose this face to go with this scene. Now notice the ones I pointed to. This face to go with this scene. This is my favorite example of them all. Why did you choose that face to go with that scene? And the answer is, it's not me in the coffin. But if you said to the person, what do people feel at funerals? He says, sad. And what do? They cry. There's a theme here, right? What they know is not how they behave. Now, what's very interesting is that the group who had not received the lobotomies gave crazy, really what we call non-associated answers, what we would have called really crazy word salad answers. Now, here's the difference. One gives answers that are connected to the story. The other gives answers that are not connected. And that is the key factor, what it does. Their knowledge is never, or not never, is often not used appropriately in a context for the situation. They know exactly what to do, but they don't do it. And that is the social disturbance, not the fact that they look like Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And which part of the areas? To a great degree, same kind of area that's disconnected in that we saw in confabulation, although most of these groups did not confabulate. So this affects behavioral emotional regulations. These are changes in personality. These are changes in social life. And I've gone back and I've recently started giving talks, because I give talks to researchers too about the data, and realized the data is not the story. That's why I wanted to talk about stories. And here are three examples of stories. The Boston bus station. I once had two of the patients who had lobotomies get sent to me by bus. Now, I hope there's nobody here from Boston. Have you ever been to Boston at the bus station and have to figure out who's had a lobotomy or not? I couldn't. In fact, the two priests I approached first were not happy. So what you couldn't do was pick it out. Now, here's another. So there was once I found them, here's the interesting. They came off the bus last. And then when I got to see them, you took a look at how they were dressed. They were just a little bit slipshody. But literally there was nothing smack dab. We used to have dancings on Wednesdays, and they were in the hospital. In those days, everybody was in their pajamas and a gown. And so the nurses would go and there'd be dancing. We said, "You going dancing?" And the guy looked at me and said, "Are you crazy? Would you go dancing in your pajamas?" And you realize the reality, the decision, right? And this is not an all or none phenomenon. But the other is the fact that they had social reliance. When I tested them, and I tested them for a long time, they finally said, "I got enough of you." And what I learned was I brought in a female examiner, and they were perfect. And what they mean, they picked up on the social cues. Now, there was a bit manipulative on my part, but I did get lots of good data out of it. So what we did is in research is come up with a paradigm in which this was a task in which we're trying to see the feedback in that area. We call it a deception task, but it's a feedback type task where you have chair there, chair here, and one chair here. And that's the subject. This is me, and there is a table, a little thing that I can close so that they can't see, and I have two cups. And I sit down, and I hide something under the cups. But I have somebody beside me who's also behind the curtain who can see where I hide the cup. That person, who is the subject, the participant, can't see it. Now, we then open the curtain. Now, this person, who has seen where it's hidden, goes up and points to one of the cups. And this person has to figure out right or wrong. And what this person does is always point to the wrong cup. It's a little bit of a deception, but you would think that's not fair. Can people with brain dysfunction learn this? And the answer is, depends where the brain dysfunction is. So what you have, that people on the lateral can figure this out perfectly fine. This area of the brain that's related to feedback and feedback emotion in relationship to social integration, which is this area down in here, this orbital frontal ventral media, are impaired. So you can actually then start to tease out objectively with tests where these are. So it's not an all or none phenomenon as in the movies. Normal individuals are on a continuum. By the way, we have some of these things. And there's a disconnection between what they know and what they do. And this comes back and over again. And context is relevant. Next story is the man who mistook his wife for his wife. Everybody knows Oliver Sacks, who sadly just departed, has these stories. The man who mistook his wife for his hat. This is a man who mistook his wife for his wife. He was in a car accident and was had a very bad, severe car accident, badly damaged, was confused, couldn't remember things, and over 10 months, couldn't remember anything, and started to recover, and then was told he could go home just before Christmas. And his wife comes by and picks him up. Now, the car was a car accident, so she had a new car, but she also wanted to fix herself up. She had new clothes, new hairdo, and they went home. They had 4 boys who were teenagers who had all grown up by a foot in the time of their very tall family. And he goes home. Now, what you're going to hear and see and read at the same time is my interview of him, bits and pieces, about a year after he had gone home. And I want you to listen to it and read it, and then we're going to discuss it.
And how many children did you have from the
4 boys and 1 girl.
Okay.
But the second girl, who I'm married to now, she picked me up on December the 5th of a year ago.
But you also lived in East Brookfield with the first Nancy.
I did, yeah.
In the same house?
The same house.
Isn't that unusual?
It was unbelievable.
So all of a sudden you came out of the hospital and you went back in the same house and lived with your family.
Well, that's about the size of it, yes.
It's really... How do you account for that?
I don't know. I tried to understand it myself, and it was virtually impossible to understand it.
If somebody would tell you that story, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I would find it hard to believe.
Right.
I would.
Exactly.
I would find it extremely hard to believe. And I probably should be defending myself more so.
Yes, you should.
I have not to date. I have not tried in any way, shape, or manner or tried to divorce the first one.
You're thinking about it, the whole family the same.
Yeah.
That's very thoughtful of you.
It sure is. So,
And she even got a girl who's just like her.
yeah, this is the irony of the whole thing, is the girl is very similar to her own parents. And she went out and did it herself.
Most amazing.
Unbelievable.
That's really...
And the only thing I could have done at the time was say no. I will not accept it. And I didn't.
By the way, you could tell how much I really enjoyed this guy. We had a great time together. But I also wanted you to listen to that tone. Is he concerned? Not at all. He's not at all concerned. And he's having a good time on doing this. And he's going back because this other woman came. I mean, the guy said, wouldn't it be if someone comes in? But the thing is, they're going to bring someone in just like the first wife, right? You don't have much choice. It's just like, I want a girl just like the girl. You get exactly the same. Now, it's a disorder that in neurology, in psychiatry, is called the Capgras syndrome. It's a delusion that somebody has replaced somebody near to you. So it's actually in the psychiatric literature. When we saw the patient, we then started to take a look, but our patient came after a car accident, and the patient had trauma. So we said, well, is that on regular? So we started to look at the literature of the Capgras syndrome and realized that most of the public cases, if not all, the person had some type of neurological disorder. So we started to look elsewhere in the literature. And in the neurologic literature, somebody who came up with, people understand Pick's disease, had something similar that he called reduplicative paramnesia. Just to find the word, so paramnesia, it's not a real amnesia. This guy's, by the way, his IQ and his memory and stuff was perfectly fine. Others, his frontal lobe functioning issues wears off. Reduplicative means he reduplicates a memory. It's very different than an imposter. He brings somebody else. So we started to look at that and said, that's what it is. It's reduplicative paramnesia, and this person's frontal lobes just were not working, and therefore he couldn't figure out. Norman Geschwin one day pigeonholed me. People don't know he's the father of behavioral neurology in North America, are pretty much one of the big names, pigeonholed me at a conference and said, I was trying to talk to him about the frontal lobes and stuff. He said, no, why won't they change the story? Why are they persistent that this is real? So MPA is Mick Alexander. He was the first author on this, and you saw him in the list of people. A lot of my work has been done with Mick. Took the person and said, okay, Bob, this is impossible. It's illogical. Remember, so you got the characteristics right. Bob knows it's impossible, right? It's unbelievable, right? It's unbelievable. And so he finally went on, and finally Bob said, you know what? I got it now. You've convinced me. I see the logic of it. Impossible. A year later, somebody goes and asks him, what about your second family and all this and stuff? He said, no, it's illogical. And then somebody had smart enough to say, is that true? And he says, no, I still have it. It's just that this Dr. Alexander's off my back now. It doesn't harass me anymore. So here's the key. It's also in this ventral medial part, but here's something that's unusual here. It also, the damage extended into the right frontal region. And finally, theory and things were coming together about this issue of persistence. There are characteristics that actually explain exactly what's going on. Number one, we know that it's not possible, and he knows it's not possible. He knows. If you would say, if somebody else, remember I phrased it, if somebody else would tell you that story, he said, I wouldn't believe it, right? And it's unbelievable. He has dysfunction in executive abilities to make decisions, but the strength of conviction in the story, that's the key. And finally, it hit us that what the difference is that in a period of confusion, he has a memory of one wife. His mind was not fully clear. He comes in, and this, quote, other woman comes in a little bit different, right? Everybody's a little bit different. But it was emotional in a way that was reinforcing. He now had one family that gave him lots of emotional gratification, and another memory, because there was this break in consciousness in between. And what happened is he had two of those, term I came up with, affectively burnt in. And then the frontal lobes does not allow him to make the judgment. And that is the construct, which is extremely important, because what this is if the emotions are strong enough, you cannot overcome it. Now I want to go back a little bit to this issue that every one case of reduplicative paramnesia, whatever is duplicated is emotionally significant to the person. That's the other thing. And by the way, there have been phenomenal things reduplicated. A cow, and my favorite cow, a car, but it's always something that's emotionally significant. So the emotional significance is very, very important. So what happens is that what you have is something that's really important and is personal, and that then has a different valence than knowledge. So I've now just given you a major separation in the construct of memory. Knowledge, which is semantic memory, which you know all the time about everything you learn. Personal memories, which is tied in with an episode. We call it episodic memory. They often work together, but they can be disconnected. So his semantic knowledge says this is impossible, but his personal episodic memory says this has to be real. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Right? Come back to the real life. And that's what we do. And by the way, we all do this at one time or another. This idea of affectively burnt in, and you'll never give it up, is so key. And it shows in two very, very important things in most of our individuals' lives. Faith, nationalism. Every one of those is driven on emotions. And you cannot change your mind. I just love watching the North America, the U.S. debates. you get this whole sense of that a model is created, what's right in the world, and everything gets interpreted through that model and through the emotions connected with that model. So, general knowledge, personal knowledge, importance of emotional contact, disconnect between knowledge and behavior. By the way, I've experienced reduplicative paramnesia, and I don't think I was brain damaged. And I'll just tell you the example. And I think all of you have, if you're going to be honest. This is an airport in Denver. I was in Denver driving, and I was late in returning, and we had a car rental, and I had to return the car, and I said to the person I was with, you stay here. And I counted back, do you see those things down on the side? I counted back the number of spaces and said, what you do is you stay here, 1, 2, 3, from this end. You sit here with the bags. I'm going to return the car. I'll run back, then we'll return. So I return the car, run back, not there. I was so ticked off. And I went back and I said, wait a minute, 1, 2, 3. And then I remember I had actually looked, Southwest Airlines. Oh, it's American Airlines now. But they must have changed it. Finally, I see a little arrow. It's both sides. Person was on the other side, exactly the same. And this is affectively burnt in. That's reduplicative paramnesia. I had, because of my emotional context, I didn't want us to be late. That's correct. And Proust, by the way, has a very interesting example if you want to read Proust about that. Now, let me go on to another case study because I want to make sure we keep on time. This is called Smile and Hold It. This is, I was scheduled to present at Grand Rounds, and Grand Rounds is where everybody comes together and you have to tell something that's erudite, and I have to do it usually weekly, and you present something to advance diagnosis and care, etc. I didn't have an exciting idea, but I was supposed to present, and then just before then I get invited, I asked to consult, examine this individual who didn't seem to obey commands. So,
hi Jane, I'm Dr. Stuss. I've been asked to come up to ask you to do a few things and to examine you, and they're very simple things. One of the things I want to do is to see how well you can perform some very simple motor commands. For example, if I ask you to close your eyes, I want you to close them, but keep them closed until I tell you to open them. Do you understand that? So are you ready? Close your eyes. No, I just did. What I wanted you to do is to close them when I tell you to, not before, but keep them closed until I tell you to open them, okay? Close your eyes. All right, let me try something different. Now this time I want you to stick out your tongue when I tell you to, but keep your tongue out. Again, keep it out. I want you to really think and keep your tongue stuck out until I tell you that you can let it go. Stick out your tongue.
you know what? I didn't say Simon Says. Now, I at least have my grand rounds, right? So I got something interesting. I'll tell you about what the disorder is. This is actually a very particular disorder after a particular brain region. But something else happened during my examination. I got a little slip-shoddy, and I wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. The disorder is called motor impersistence. It's the inability to sustain a movement to command. Even though the ability to understand is normal, the ability to perform the movement is normal, you cannot sustain it. So it's the ability to stay on task with the task, and this is particularly for motor. So I then said again, and I was being distracted, and you will see that I happened to repeat the command before she opened her eyes.
Let's try it again. Again, when I tell you to do something, I want you to keep on doing it until I tell you to stop, Jane, okay? So let's work on this one and closing your eyes. Are you ready? Close your eyes. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. Close your eyes.
Right. So I was going to, grand rounds were going to be great. I'm going to show what I can do. And I'm going to go, and I just found a way to overcome a symptomatic problem. I could repeat the command, they can do it. If I don't, they open it. So we go to grand rounds, and I'm presenting her, and the first thing I have to do is to show the disorder, right? Because you can't show how great I am without showing the disorder.
I'm going to ask you again to do that very simple command that we did the other day. Remember, when I tell you to do it, you just keep on doing it until I tell you to stop. Here we go. Close your eyes. What are you doing?
So there's something interesting there about lessons. So one of the things is, why could the internal talk work, and why did it eventually fail? So I'm going to give another story that's not the same, but it's going to drive home the same lesson. And this is of a person who was a teacher and had a right frontal lobe damage, and I was asked to a tumor removed, but had difficulty then organizing her life, and she was a teacher, she was preparing, and I actually took her on for rehab. I did 1 year of cognitive and psychosocial rehab, and I improved her life significantly. She couldn't get up and brush her teeth with it in 2 hours. She just got so distracted. So we had a whole series of techniques and got to brush her teeth, etc. But I realized I could only get it 50%. She wasn't going to get back to work. So my clinical recommendation, take disability in early retirement, enjoy family life. And she says to me, I have a typical frontal lobe syndrome. I've read your books. I see what you're telling me. We made substantial improvement, but there's still problems. And so I say, what will you do? And she says, well, I'll teach 1 course next year and then 2 the following year. So and you see again that disconnect to what she says and what she does. So she went back to teach. The students rebelled. Principal connected me, see if I could help. And I go to her office. This is now her office. And we're sitting. She's sitting over there, and I'm sitting here. And I'm asking her, what are we going to do? How are we going to be? What are the things that are going to go? And she's telling me we're going to teach 1 course. And her office was a mess. Nothing unpacked, boxes. And finally I said, look, your principal called me. And then I had this idea. There was an empty chair there. And I said, there's your principal, right there. Now, he told me that I have to work on this deal. I want you to go sit in that chair and talk to that person over there. Meaning talk to herself. And so she goes over, and she's the principal. And she said, okay, now what are we going to tell her? And she said, she has to go on early retirement. She just can't do it. She just can't sustain it. She can't work, etc. I thought, there we go, I've done it. Put her back in her chair, and I said, all right, we have a plan? She said, of course we have a plan. Next year I'll teach 1 course. But there are lessons here behind this. And the lessons behind this is that there's an area of the brain in both of them that were affected that was similar. The right lateral region. And what the right lateral region does is help us to stay on task. It's very, very important to get things done and to manage. It's part of what we call executive functions of the plan, being able to stay on task. On the left side of the brain, we call it for planning. So here we've got somebody with perfect knowledge, disconnected from action. We've done this. Inability to stay on task, both of them. One of them from motor movement. Not everybody shows the motor movement one, but the motor movement one is strictly an extension of the ability of any disorder of staying on task. She couldn't stay on task to brush her teeth, get things done. We have to get things set up. what techniques did I evolve to help this? In the first one, and both are the same, self-talk. Remember I said about planning? The left frontal lobe is important for planning and organization, and one of the ways it does it is through self-talk. So what that Jean was doing, the young woman with the motor and persistence, what I did externally was talk and have control. That's one of the rehab techniques. You become the frontal lobes of the individual. She then took it on, but the problem is she still has that other problem of inability of staying on task. When I disrupt her, the task planning goes down. So even though you can use it for rehab, it does not extend unless you can do something with the other monitoring task. We've shown this in reaction time tests, simple reaction time, and between each reaction time, it's what we call interstimulus interval. They can come fast or they can come slow in between each. If you are fast, if the time in between is short, you should be fast, you should be slower, and then as you get longer in between, you get faster, and everybody does, except if you have damage there. You just can't keep on. Even in that 4 seconds, you drift off in the techniques. So external cues talk are helpful. They can help modify behavior. This is part of what we do in rehab. Part of what, by the way, it's part of what I do in a daily life for myself, is self-talk. Okay, we're wrapping up, and somebody in this kind of on the end in the stories of where we are. And this is stories called Bob, Do You Love Me? And you'll see how it comes forward. This was an individual who was a truck driver who had remarried. He and his wife had a second marriage. He, one night, didn't come home late overnight, not like this other guy who said that he had fallen off his truck and he had damaged himself. And this is what he was like after. And you will see again, this is the most wonderful person. This was, by the way, in The Nature of Things in 2001. We did this.
To be honest, the first time I met him, I thought he was quite sarcastic. And then as I got to know him, he's a very caring, loving person, cared about how you as a person felt. We became very good friends.
As how she felt as a
We were
person.
always joking, laughing. We talked for hours. I mean, we could talk about everything. I don't have that luxury anymore with him. I don't have, so I've lost a friend, but we get through.
I'm getting upset.
So,
I want you to pay attention to this.
I'll be all right.
He looks like he's very sensitive and caring, right? Now,
But to give you an example of how I used to feel, when she got upset, I get upset. I don't get upset anymore. I know she's upset, and it's probably not the best terminology to use, but it's almost like I don't care. When she says that I don't have the emotions and be able to pick up on her emotions, she's very right, I don't. There's a big piece missing.
so you can see what happened, and I'll show you where the damage is.
It's like you're not 51 anymore, you actually get reversed and you're only 15 again. And I want to play. There's nobody to play with, so she gets it. I can't go out, I can't go down to my friend's house because he's not 15 anymore either. And he's working.
So you can see what's left. It's very subtle, isn't it? He had trouble because nobody understood that he had any problems whatsoever. And he had damage in a very particular part of the brain, this very part of the brain, area 10, which is the area that's the highest developed in man. In fact, it differentiates us at the level from the monkey to the chimp. It differentiates this. And we have a very high level, and it seems to be very important for this ability for us to interact and communicate to understand other individuals. And you can see where it is, and that's in that very polar area, and that's where his damage was. falling off. That's all he had damaged. And he is just disconnected from any type of feelings. Not that he can't do it, and we actually set that up. It's called self-reflective capabilities. It's theory of mind, understanding yourself to understand others. And he's lost that. He's lost that. Other than what he has is knowledge based. This is what we did for rehab. We could not rehab this. So what we did was to set up artificial structure. We then said, okay, he used to be sensitive by our present. We now had it on, he had special days, and he had buy flowers and occasional Fridays, whether he felt like it or not, he did it. Now, I know there are a lot of people saying, oh yeah, well that's, that goes on every time in our week. So, let me wind up. Where have we come? We refined our concept of the frontal lobes. It's no longer such a mystery. But you can see why it's been so hard to understand, because it does these things that are such a high level that we had a tough time coming up with techniques to examine this. But based upon this separation, we now have new rehabilitation techniques. And here's the other thing, is that there probably is very few disorders that are not neurological in the sense of acquired neurological, such as autism, schizophrenia, small stroke, certain dementias, that are not considered to have some aspect of frontal lobes involved, and that this helps to understand, and that knowledge goes both ways. So here's what we've done. We now have learned to separate out the polar area. We've learned to separate out the lateral area. We now understand the issue of the ventral medial, the orbital frontal region, and we also understand this whole issue of get up and go on the superior medial and the anterior cingulate. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
I want to ask, you gave us some really fascinating stories, but I want to get a sense of the context of this. How many people have these frontal lobe problems? Are they all brought on by trauma? Or, should we all be worrying at some point we're all going to have stuff like this?
So there are several aspects of things that, yes. So number one, it's fairly frequently caused by things such as stroke and by traumatic brain injury. In fact, traumatic brain injury actually has a predisposition for frontal lobe dysfunction as well as temporal lobes, so that if you think of the issue of concussions and all the sports and everything, this is one of the things that are important. It is involved. There are now things that people are studying, things such as depression, right? So depression involves frontal lobes. Now, those are not acquired disorders. Those are biological. And so there are people working on treatments that you can take a look at depression and say, well, if there is a depression that's more emotionally based, it's in a kind of one of the areas of the limbic system, that orbital frontal. And then if it's on an area towards the polar, it's more self-reflective. So the treatment's actually being able to use things such as functional imaging. So frontal function, that's why I started off with canopies. There's virtually nothing that we do that doesn't have us involve those abilities. And do they get disturbed? Yes. And they also are disturbed within the normal context, right? That people don't always have this idea of I have a bottle in front of me rather than the frontal lobotomy. It's the same thing. It's a reversal lobotomy. You behave in a way that is if you had frontal lobe dysfunction. And you do have frontal lobe temporarily.
But that's what I was going to say. A lot of this stuff can just be temporary. It's part of life. It's not always a dysfunction.
No, it's exactly correct. And part of it is life. We don't know even the normal variation. There's a developmental perspective about this that occurs. But there's also an issue of education. They're starting to do some work on this idea of having a self-reflectiveness and an empathy that's connected, that they're actually able to train some of those things. You can actually train abilities where people can actually stay on task more. And I'm thinking not patience within the normal range. There's a huge variation, and virtually all of us could benefit from some of those aspects of understanding that the abilities in the frontal lobes control everything else in the brain. So if you understand how they're controlled and you improve the control, you're going to improve your function.
Yeah, and you mentioned there's a developmental aspect. In fact, when you were talking about motor impersistence, inability to stay on task, I was thinking, geez, I have 2 teenagers at home. I just have a diagnosis now of what they have, right?
Yeah, my kids remember. I used to put up a sign, "Stay on task," little signs, and they still remember that. And actually, some of them still actually do it every now and then. Stay on task. But you're right. There is a developmental perspective. Part of what people used to argue is that it's actually the last part of the brain to actually myelinate, especially the connectivity. And if you take a look at the frequency of delinquency, for example, which is inappropriate behavior, it peaks in the kind of late teens, early thing, and then when people get 35, the delinquency drops off. It's also a period of time when the frontal lobes start to get more myelinated. So the question is it I don't know if anybody's done those studies, but there are things that go with the developmental trajectory.
But we get a sense that the brain doesn't change. You're saying the brain changes a lot over time.
It changes an awful lot, and you can change it. This is one of the aspects about it. My history, I'm a high school teacher originally, and the belief, one of the reasons I went into science was the belief that if you understood how the brain works, you can actually teach in a way that maximizes people's abilities, and you will change brain functioning. You actually will. And you can change how the networks, you can change it from the viewpoint. We started off from the viewpoint of networks. Tom had mentioned about network connectivity. You can actually work on how the brains interconnect through training. So it's, in one sense, you can maximize abilities. And that's what we do when we do people with cognitive rehabilitation.
So should we be doing brain exercises the way we do our running and our weights? Should we be doing...
Right, and there are, so first of all, you're absolutely right. So running and weight, all of that is key because all of those are important. Remember I said this is all brain, right? So that's key. I think absolutely correct. The point is that the brain is not a muscle. The brain is a series of interconnected abilities, and you have to understand how these abilities interconnect. So you can't just say, okay, I'm going to improve my memory and I'll memorize more things. What you have to do is say, how do I improve my strategy for putting information into my memory system and then bringing it out? Can of peas, right? That's that story there. How do I, if it's important to me, do I effectively burn it in? So in other words, you take this knowledge of the brain functioning to maximize the abilities. So yes, you can do them, but I think what you want to be able to do is, of the abilities that are done, they're ones that actually are able to have a more generic thing rather than just pumping a kind of a muscle or a tennis swing.
So what does someone who's a world expert like you, what kind of brain exercises do you do? Can you share your secrets?
Well, I do most of there. So I talk to myself a lot.
Doesn't that get you in trouble sometimes?
I usually by myself when I talk to myself. But I slow things down. I'll externalize. So very important. So if I'm multitasking, particularly as one gets older, I will break it down into a components part, which is the planning part. I will then break it down into a task. I will then make sure that I do one thing at a time, that I'll focus abilities. So I'll take the knowledge I have of how the brain works, and I'll actually implement that in my daily life. Now, do we do it always successfully? Answer is no, because you also have to put things into context. So one of the things we haven't talked much about, but there's a little of it, is you can actually make people perform better in one environment than another, depending upon what the context is. So one has to be able to make a judgment of that and say, all right, what do I do? But I use those techniques of knowledge of the frontal lobe functioning to strategize usually my day. But I'll do a lot of external things. We have Google and daily planners for a reason. But you should also think of why you're using them, right? I think so. This idea of having a self-reflective capability is important.
But it almost sounds like CBT, like cognitive behavior therapy.
Yeah, there's a lot of CBT that's although they haven't necessarily thought of it from the viewpoint of frontal lobe, but that builds upon those constructs. Absolutely correct. But what's also important though is you've got to build in. So remember, cognitive behavioral therapy. But you also have to think of building in this issue of self-reflectiveness. So one has to, if you're in an environment where somebody says something that is hurtful, you actually have to also be reflective. Does that impact me? Does it change who I am? Or if you're a bit depressed in the day, you then count your blessings. All of these things are techniques that add on. So that's the one thing I wanted to get across in the frontal lobe function is it does planning, it does emotional regulation, it does drive, it does self-reflectiveness. So you have to think of all of those, not just the cognitive improvement. You have to think of the affective embellishment, how you react in social situations, what judgments do you make.
Because with things like depression, for example, a big problem is negative self-talk. People reinforce their bad perceptions. Is that all in the frontal lobe, or is it?
Yep. It's, and the body. If you're depressed, the one good thing I can give you advice, and people have actually done research before you go to bed. And people say count your blessings. Say 3 positive things that happened. If a negative thought comes out, don't allow it to stay. Actually change it. But you need tools. You got to have a positive thought in your pocket, right? So you're going to just and usually it's something that's salient and important to you. But you need to do it, and you literally you make a decision. That's the left frontal lobe saying, "I will not do this. I will do this," and it actually is effective.
And I remember doing a story once about someone who was being treated with CBT, and her method was they put little, sticky notes up with these positive things that she would read before bed, and anytime she walked by the mirror, it was an eating disorder issue, and say, "I'm beautiful, I look good, I feel good." And those are really, they seem like simple things, but they work.
I do it. I have hair.
Maybe that one should be a little bigger. I don't know.
But you're aware, there are techniques. So this idea of staying on task is literally, I would do that. I'd put it up for that. But the whole issue of positive affirmations, one of the things you have to do is that you don't get yourself caught into an internal loop. So you have to externalize. So I gave you a good example on that self-talk. I did the self-talk, and then she internalized it, right? And so actually in developmental psychology, the Vygotsky, Russian, that's actually how you work on kids. People say, allow the kids to do anything they want. Mistake. Because they have to actually have patterns of behavior. So often those come from the way a parent instructs, then the child self-talks on themselves, and then they continue on and internalize that. And it's essentially setting up standards of behavior, social conscience.
And I was struck by something when you were giving your talk, that a lot of these tests you did were so simple. A ball under a cup, just a visual cue and order. When I go to a lot of neurotalks and it's all about fMRIs and genetics and all this fancy stuff, why is your research so simple?
Well, there's no...
Or the tech... Not maybe the tech... Why are the techniques so simple?
Thank you. So there's one obvious reason, obviously.
No negative self-talk.
So it actually is an outcome of something I had to learn by example. So the frontal lobes we were taught, if they're so important to everything, they have to be important for really fancy schmancy complex things. So we used to do complex tasks, and everybody would fail them. Even normal people would fail. And then one day we took a chance and said, what if we decided that what they do are simple things, but they do it in a way that enables complex behaviors to occur? And so what we did is backed off and started doing very simple things to understand what the simple process was, and then we scaffolded it up in there. And so if you're doing rehab, you do the same thing. You will start off with a simple construct, and you build it up. But the best example are the simple ones. The complex ones are often lost. So, and if you take a look at fMRI and doing that, often studies with fMRI who have not gone through the other stages before, you put somebody in, brain lights up, think, what does it mean? So the idea is, if you can be simple and show that a brain region is important for a very simple process, I then can use that to interpret my fMRI. And we've now done this and taken fMRI and shown I can now do fairly complex things, but depending how I set it up, I'll show that this brain region lights up, this brain region lights up, this brain region lights up, to do a more complicated task. But it's simple things put together. That's a network. That's the construct of a neural network. So it's really disconnecting and working things together. But it's also a way to connect to patients, to individuals with disorder.
And I should mention, because when I do these, I try to be careful about the jargon, and I use the term fMRI. So magnetic resonance imaging is like a picture that we can take of the brain, and the F it's more like a video.
Right. While they're performing a function, you see whether the brain lights up because that brain region is taking up more blood and oxygenation.
But when you do these fMRIs, I've read some of your papers, essentially it shows the same things as when you have the cup and the ball.
Right. But the interesting part is that we had to do the other one first to interpret it properly, because otherwise what it does is it provides a structure for interpretation, that I know which brain regions are necessary. And I'll give you one example. One time I was at a conference and somebody gave a talk on imaging and showed that on a spatial task that this right frontal lobe lit up, and that they found this new region for doing this new spatial task. And myself and Michael Petridis from the Montreal Neurological Institute were there, and we went just ballistic because we said, have you ever seen a patient? And this person said, no. Well, let me just tell you, you can take out that whole region and that person could do your task perfectly fine. So it's doing something, but it's not doing what you say that brain. So it's lighting up doesn't mean it's a necessary component.
And I want to bring people in. There's a mic that's going to rove around. I want to get some audience questions. And while they're raising their hands, I want to ask you one more question that's related to that, of the whole lobotomy question. The suggestion that, you just said you can take out a big chunk of the brain, does that mean it's useless? Or what does it mean that you can take some out? Because we often hear that, we don't use 90% of our brain or whatever.
Yeah. And first of all, it depends, again, whether you're an adult, whether you're a child. There are stories where people have been with a developmental disorder growing up and they have a whole hemisphere missing. But I'm talking as an adult. It's impossible to take out a section of the brain without it doing. It depends what process you're looking at. And I'll give you the example that just drives me absolutely crazy, because what I've shown here was the fact of how important this right frontal lobe in the polar region is. If you would go to most neurosurgical centers in the entire world, they would say that area is irrelevant, and the point is, they haven't done the right thing. So it's important for humor. It's important for self-awareness. It's important for staying on task. It's important for emotional effectiveness. It's important for episodic memories. So you also have to know what you're looking for to tell what the relevance is. But every part of the brain is necessary. It's in its network capacity that you have to figure out what role it's playing. If it functionally lights up, it may mean it's involved. It doesn't mean it's necessary for that function.
Okay. Did we find a question? We have mics on either side. Yeah.
Only questions I can answer, please.
Yeah, it's on. Just go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit, leading on from where you just were, talk a little bit about the notion of rewiring the brain and what some of the limitations are to that and what can be done?
Yeah, so the whole issue of brain plasticity. So first of all, you have to understand that there are multiple aspects of brain plasticity. So one could be a rewiring. Two, it could be another part of the brain taking over. Three, it could be a part close to it taking over. Four, it could be using adaptation of a different function to handle that function that was damaged. So it's very important to understand that when people talk about brain plasticity, they're often incorporating many different aspects of brain plasticity. So does the brain rewire? And the answer is absolutely yes. It rewires best when you're younger, but it can rewire at any time. Rehabilitation, cognitive rehabilitation, affective rehabilitation is in essence rewiring behaviors. Now, do we measure it all the time? No, but it has been shown that when you do measure it, when you do a specific task, you actually can show different connectivities in the brain that's happening. But sometimes what happens is a different part of the brain will take over, or the part of the brain that may be more active. So just to realize that there's many, many aspects of brain plasticity. That doesn't mean everything can be rewired. Will we get there someday? Sometimes it depends. You have to have enough neural tissue there and connectivity that this can occur. But it can be everything. We just don't know that yet. But yes, compared to what we used to think 10, 15 years ago, there's enormous potential for brain plasticity.